Good afternoon, folks. It is Monday, the 9th of January, 2023. I've taken the unusual step of recording this video blog or vlog. I'm reminded of an incident that happened in, it was from March 1977 through to perhaps March 1978. And I can pin it down to that date because I'd not long had gotten my motorcycle license, and due to the way the licensing was at the time, I was riding a 50cc motorcycle. It wasn't like an automatic scooter or some mopeds that have pedals, something like that. It was a 5-speed gearbox with a manual clutch. And just a reminder that various laws differ from country to country on what qualifies as a motorcycle or a moped or a scooter, and those laws change over time. And indeed the New Zealand laws, where we are here now, have changed quite substantially since the 1970s. I'm remembering because that was, although it was only a small motorbike, it was the only one I had that actually had a park light, where you could take the ignition key out, you could turn it all the way around into a certain position and take it out, and it left on a dimmer front light at the headlight and a tail light. I had that motorbike for about 1 year, from March 1977 to March, I had it for no longer than about a year. Might have had it for a couple of months longer than a year, might have had it a couple of months shorter than a year, but a year at the most. The story revolves around a Suzuki motorbike that's known, we called it as a Titan, and it was a Suzuki T-500. I made a written comment on a certain YouTube channel. I'm just going to change over the TV and I will read out most of my comment, but there's parts that I did not put in that comment, and that's what I wanted to keep the historical record accurate, and that's why I'm doing this blog. I've just got to pull up that and I will be reading it off the screen here. Something I'm acutely aware of when, just flick back, make sure it's still working. Something I'm acutely aware of when I reply to things like YouTube or Facebook that a lot of other people don't seem to think about is that the internet is international. So when you do need to be aware that only the vast majority of the people that see YouTube, Facebook, all those kind of things are actually in countries other than New Zealand. New Zealand is definitely the far off corner of the world. Right. Here's my story about a Suzuki 500. And I will point out when I diverge and add extra information that isn't in the written submission here on the YouTube channel. The YouTube channel itself, I've just come across this one by chance yesterday or the other day. It's called 2 Vintage, so it's number 2 and the word vintage. And in this case, the guy has found for sale somewhere, he's in America somewhere, a motorcycle from 1970s, and he shows somewhere, he goes out and negotiates with the seller and he buys it and he does some fixing up to it and he gets a little bit of a test run around the house on an icy road. So he's a very brave man. I would have absolutely loved to have a go on one of these motorcycles, but with the ice on the road, I think I would have just waited for visited in a different season. Right. Here in New Zealand, we're sort of like Australia. but you've got to go another 1,000 miles southeast. The Suzuki T-500 two-cylinder air-cooled 500cc two-stroke was sometimes known as a Titan. That's what I heard it called. Apparently in England and Europe it had different names. There was a few around, although I never got a chance to own one or ride one myself. Back when I first had my motorcycle licence and I was riding small 50cc motorbike, so I was still living with my parents in a rural town, fringing the outskirts of Christchurch, New Zealand, in 1977 or early 1978. One evening, while riding home in the dark, I came across a horrific motorcycle crash. And this is where I'll divert it for a moment. This is where I remember. Because all my other motorcycles, you had to have the engine running. One of them ran on battery. But anyway, for the headlight. This was one motorbike I could turn off the engine, turn the key all the way around, pull it out, and leave parking lights running. So I could have some extra light in the general area, with a tail light with vehicles coming up behind, and with some dim glow from the parking light headlight. One evening while riding home in the dark, I came across a horrific motorcycle crash. The accident had occurred at the intersection of, looking at Google now and working it out, Birches Road and Ledleys Road in the rural area Ladbrooks, which is a few kilometres closer to the city than Lincoln Township. And it's just before you get to Prebbleton Township. So people are familiar with the rural area southwest of Christchurch City will know. The Suzuki rider, by the time I stopped, there was already a number of vehicles had stopped. This is we're talking 1970s here, so it wasn't a terribly busy road, but it was, well enough trafficked that if an accident happened, people would be able to come and help before too long. And obviously I spoke to some other people at the scene. The Suzuki rider, as best we could figure, had gone in through the front windscreen and out through the back window of the car. The car involved was what we would consider a large car, by New Zealand standards at the time, a Holden Kingswood. That, my recollection, it's a Holden Kingswood. I think you call that model the HQ. I think it was the early 70s model, maybe late 60s. It was a General Motors Australia product. A little bit similar to some of the American, but a little bit smaller. Most of them had a 6-cylinder engine, but there were some V8 options. But the 6-cylinder engine was standard. In those days, New Zealand law had only required toughened glass for the front windscreens. So yes, the front windscreen breaks into small blunt pieces like the side and rear windows of cars still do today. It was only later that they changed the law to demand laminated front windscreens. The car ended up having gone off the road through a farm fence and into the adjoining sort of open field or paddock. I don't know if it was a cereal crop or something, but it was, wasn't trees, it was just open, grass for grazing sheep or something. But the car was like sideways off into the paddock. Looking at Google Maps, it's approximately opposite the small farmhouse, which you can find now if you go on Google Map, and it would be 176 Birches Road, probably Ladbrooks. Exactly where they draw the boundary for certain rural areas, I don't know. They might consider it Prebbleton, because it's in between Ladbrooks and Prebbleton. Ladbrooks isn't actually a town anyway. Prebbleton's a town, Lincoln's a town, and the area in between is known as Ladbrooks. There's a couple of buildings there. There used to be a petrol station. That's gone 20 odd years ago. The woman driving the car was suffering more from shock than anything else, and was some of the earliest people to stop were giving assistance. It's worth noting. People weren't just standing around rubbernecking. So the woman driving the car was suffering more from shock than anything else. The motorcycle rider, a young guy local to the adjoining Lincoln area, and his name was sort of friends of a friends of a friends kind of thing. His name was Stephen Tiplady, and I remember the name because it's sort of quite unusual. I don't know if that's Stephen with a V or Stephen with a PH. He was severely injured, but members of the motorists passing who'd already stopped before me had... So members of the public who had come across the crash scene some minutes before I did, not a hell of a long time, had covered him with a blanket and were comforting him as best they could. He was on the side of the road. Remember, there's a tiny little bit of gravel or stones, and then there's grass verge, and then you get like a farm fence and the paddock. So they'd covered him in a blanket and were comforting him as best they could. This area is dark. I'll just digress from the written for a moment here. It's a rural road, a T-junction on a rural road. There are no street lights on the rural roads. They usually have one street light, whichever pole is nearest to the corner of the intersection. There's electricity poles. One of them will go up a bit, have a street light off it. So there was limited light around. I don't know if there was moonlight necessarily, but there was some limited light around. There's very few farmhouses in that area. There's no light spilling out from them. I saw the people who were tending him lift up the blanket for a moment to check his wounds, and you couldn't see much detail, and it was dark, but certainly the bottom half of him was a mess. So shortly after I got there, remember this is in the time well before, there were no cell phones, this is 1970s. Before too long, an ambulance arrived, having come from the nearest city depot. And for us, in Christchurch, there's really only one, what Americans might call a trauma one, or a trauma hospital or whatever. There was one particular hospital for just maternity cases. There was one particular hospital for long-term rehabilitation, spinal injuries. There was one that did mostly with chest and pulmonary type, and again, longer term, and a separate one for psychiatric and mental health. So there's really only the one main hospital right on the edge of Christchurch Central, and that's the trauma hospital where car accidents and heart attacks and that go to. So the ambulance would have had to come out about 9 miles, I think, from the centre. Whatever that is in kilometres, 15 kilometres, I think, from memory. Before too long, an ambulance arrived, having come from the nearest city depot, and the motorbike rider was given proper first aid by trained paramedics as they loaded him up and whizzed him into the nearest major hospital. Christchurch wasn't a terribly big city, we only have one. Remember that this is decades before mobile phones, so folks would have had to go and knock on the door of a local farmhouse or drive to the nearest town, either Lincoln that way or Prebbleton that way, and knock on the door of a house and to call emergency services. The guy did survive. I just make that clear, he did survive. And despite his injuries. I mentioned that I intend to make a vlog because there's some interesting things. I do not recall how badly the motorcycle was damaged, but I was able to easily identify it. Whether it said, I don't know if it necessarily said Titan, but it certainly said Suzuki and 500. I could see it was a two-stroke by the cylinder head fins and that. You can sort of see if it's something's a four-stroke or two-stroke. I later heard, as I say, because it's a small community and you hear through people are friends of friends and friends, I later heard that he claimed he was sober when the accident occurred. We know that young people, sometimes they drove faster than the speed limit, sometimes they drive faster than the conditions. The road was dry at the time, from my recollection. It wasn't raining, so the road was dry. So we have no reason to believe that he was necessarily drunk or any other thing else. I never heard if blame was found on one party or the other. I know sometimes people are all too quick to blame motorcyclists riding recklessly or whatever, and yet sometimes it's the car drivers aren't careful, and they'll pull out on motorcyclists. They don't care sometimes. Some motorcycles, especially the smaller ones, tend to have magneto lights that are very weak. The larger motorbikes often have a different kind of alternator, and even if they do have a magneto for ignition and lighting, it's a larger magneto, tends to run a much more brighter headlight bulb. So and more tail light bulbs. So yeah. Anyway. But he claimed he was sober. I never heard if blame was found one way or the other for either party. There's no streetlights on that piece of road. It's a rural intersection. May have had one light just at the intersection. Here in New Zealand around that time, the Suzuki, there was also the GT 380, and I'm not sure if that was a double or a triple, a twin or triple, and the 750 was a triple. I believe it actually had effectively the same pistons in it as this 500. It's just there was a 3-cylinder, and that was actually water cooled. People nicknamed it the water bus. They were considered very heavy and a bit cumbersome, but they were really good in a straight line. Remember, a 2-stroke 3-cylinder will be as smooth as if it was a 6-cylinder if it was a 4-stroke, because you're getting twice the number of power strokes for every revolution of the engine compared to a 4-stroke. So I think the 380s and the 750s were more common. I don't think there were a hell of a lot of these Suzuki T-500s imported into New Zealand back in those days. Because of our import laws, licensing laws, and regulations on what you could get finance on, it greatly affected what people could buy in the way of motorbikes to ride. You could only buy a 50cc motorbike or 50cc scooter on low deposit. Anything else you needed, I think, a minimum 60% deposit. The government's argument was they didn't want young people signing up for big loans to buy motorbikes, other than just a little scooter or motorbike to get them around. Here's a bit that I didn't say in my written thing. This is absolutely the truth. And it sounds like it's one of those kids' ghost stories you tell around the campfire. And it haunts me to this day. When the ambulance arrived, one of the people who'd been helping went up to, when they did initially, 2 or 3 people, I guess 2, normally as minimum crew, left the ambulance to go and tend to the bloke initially. And one of the helpers, one of the people who stopped there, I saw him standing there holding something. I just grab a prop. And he held something up in his hand, and I could see it silhouetted amongst the very little light there was, and it was hanging sort of like that angle. And he said to the ambulance guy, he said, I found his arm, but I couldn't find his leg. And it was clearly a hand up to the elbow and the rest of the arm. The ambulance officer took a blanket and wrapped it up. They did take it with them, but it wasn't able to be reattached. It was a whole arm. Anyway, as I mentioned, Stephen Tiplady did survive, had a really good attitude, and I don't know whether he lost his whole leg or it was off at about the knee, but he certainly lost all of the lower part of his leg, and exactly where it was amputated I don't know. And once he'd recovered, he would be at the local pub, and a couple of his mates would lift him up and steady him as might be necessary on the edge of the pool table, and he would play pool with one arm. So that's a great attitude for you. So this incident is now 45 years ago, is it? Something like that. As far as I know, he may have had a long and healthy life ever since, and good on him. And the word of thanks there is to the ambulance crew and to those people who were just on cars, or could have been another motorbike, who stopped on a dark night on a country road and rendered aid as best they could until the proper trained ambulance personnel were there. And they saved a life, and by all accounts he had as best life as he could following that. I don't know if the motorbike was ever able to be repaired, but who knows. So there's one for the historians out there, and I'll put some appropriate search terms in the YouTube video. And Stephen, if you're out there, say hi.